This is The Intersection. The place where faith, current events, and politics come together. Join host Andrew Shawaraya on the journey to educate, challenge, and inspire our nation back to a path of truth and liberty.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we have with us Rabbi Lapin, and I've said before, like I've said, Rabbi, of any of the individuals that I know that I consider to be spiritual leaders or leaders of faith in the world, you're one, Rabbi, that I would sit down and that I would truly just listen to, because what you say and the way that you present it, it commands the attention, and we certainly need that.
Thank you. It's really great to be with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to help you in the very valuable work you do, I think, which is to bring the ideas that lie at the intersection of faith and politics, because that's really what drives all hope of change in the country. So thanks for having me on.
Rabbi, we don't have a lot of time with you, and I want to just get straight into one of the most important questions that I think needs to be asked, and it's one that our society has been kind of taking it in a turn for the worst. But what insight do you have, or what would your encouragement be when it comes to Christians being involved in the political process, as far as activism is concerned, maybe even running for office? And we heard from Pastor Rafael Cruz, and he said that one of the things that he said was, if the righteous don't run for office and if the righteous don't vote, it just leaves the wicked to vote for the wicked. And we certainly resonate with that, but I want your take on how far should we as individuals with Judeo-Christian principles take the political process?
The answer is that we first of all have to define what politics is. And if you think about it, you realize that politics is nothing more and nothing less than the practical application of our most deeply held values. For instance, confiscatory rates of taxation on hard-working families in order to underwrite multi-generational dysfunction is somebody's deepest value. It isn't mine, but it is somebody's, because it was by promoting that value that votes were obtained, which put specific people into positions of power, which enabled them to pass specific legislation, which incrementally raised taxes on American families to a point higher than they've ever been before. So these things do flow from values. When America has fallen in and out of love with something called the inheritance tax, or more appropriately and accurately called the death tax, which is essentially, again, something that flows from a very deep idea. You've got to decide whether we are like animals that have no particular relationship to their offspring, or we're humans touched by the finger of God, in which a very special relationship exists between each of us and our own children. The inheritance tax is designed to essentially say, look, we don't see why your children should benefit disproportionately when you pass on. It should belong, your possessions should now belong to all the children, and we, the government, will act on their behalf to seize your possessions, and we will distribute it to all children. So I think it's important to realize that politics is the practical application of deeply held values, and deeply held values, biblically formed for most of us or not for others, deeply held values are of no significance if there's no actual follow-through. For instance, honor your father and your mother is a deeply held value, but if parents don't actually convey that in practical terms to their children, it's valueless. And so step number one, unquestionably, is that being as seriously observant and fervent Jews and Christians have a very deeply embedded set of values, it would be surely just frivolous to ignore the practical application of those and leave politics to everybody else. The second reason is that the condition in which the country now finds itself is essentially a lifeboat. We really are in a very perilous set of circumstances, closer perhaps to the brink than this country has ever been before, but so close to the brink that we have seen other empires failing to come back from this close. So you could easily imagine us in a lifeboat right now, and we really are hoping to survive. Meanwhile, up ahead in the lifeboat, I see a bunch of people drilling holes through the hull into the water, which is surely going to sink our heavily overloaded lifeboat. And now I've got to decide, do I interfere with them, or do I say, you know what, it's not my business. I bought a ticket on this ocean liner, it sank, I'm now in the lifeboat, I'm just going to leave it to everybody else. Again, no sane person retaining a healthy love of life will fail to involve himself in preventing those people from drilling holes in the lifeboat. Right now, the political clash in the country is between those who I think are drilling holes in the lifeboat of American society and those who are doing their utmost to salvage and keep the boat afloat. So yes, I think it's absolutely imperative. I think it's a religious mandate on each and every religious American to be extremely involved in the political process.
Rabbi, should our principles, the principles that we hold and that we put into the political process, should those be biblical?
I'm sorry, would you say that again? I don't think I quite caught what you asked.
Should the principles that we hold that you mentioned that we're putting into practice through the political process, as your definition of politics, should those be biblical?
Well, yes. I mean, I think essentially that we have two conflicting visions for human society. I mean, there are others. There are parts of the world that use a tribal model. Most of the Arab world uses a tribal model. Part of Africa uses a tribal model. There are parts of the world that tragically have no model at all, and they exist in a state of disorder and chaos and anarchy. But in terms of structured human societies, you've essentially got the Abrahamic model, which was the one that the founders of the United States of America chose to follow. And then you have the Nimrod model, characterized in chapter 11 of the book of Genesis, the Tower of Babel, which is essentially centralized control and a treatment of human beings as if they're nothing but sophisticated animals or $10 worth of cheap chemicals, and that's really what we have now. So yes, if you can't combat something with nothing, and since virulent secularism is the weapon that is being brandished by the left, then indeed only the values of the Bible stand a chance of effectively defeating that.
That's how we restore the heart and the soul of our nation, is God. There's no other way. That's my belief, and from what it sounds like, that's pretty much what you were talking about as well. I'm going to let Jonathan kind of ask a couple of questions. Jonathan joining us on the broadcast. JD?
Rabbi, thanks so much for joining us. Firstly...
Sure, and by the way, just...
go ahead.
Good business purposes, can we give out my website as well, please?
Of course we can.
Absolutely.
I actually have some questions from your website, Rabbi. So before I just get to my questions, I just want to give you some feedback. I saw you on Glenn Beck a couple of weeks ago, and I think your answer made me think. I thought I thought deep about issues. So, like, I go a lot deeper than Republican, Democrat, Liberal, Conservative. I actually think this debate is status versus anti-status. But your answer about this actually goes back to creation, whether you believe you're created by God or whether basically...
That's right.
were all cattle, so to speak, and that you gave the example in the story of, well, can a cow come up to his farmer and say, I don't like the amount of milk you're taking off me and the way the government sees us? I thought that was one of the greatest answers. Maybe if you could share a bit with our audience, in case they didn't see it, just for that mindset, because I thought it was so invaluable.
Sure, absolutely. And I couldn't hear clearly, but did we give listeners my website?
No, it's youneedarabbi.com.
Yes, indeed. youneedarabbi.com. That's exactly right. And I humbly submit my candidacy for that role. But the idea there is that we are either animals that over a lengthy period of time evolved into sophisticated animals, or else we're very special creatures at the apex of creation, touched by the finger of God. And our treatment of property is a very important way of identifying that. The viewpoint that holds the secular worldview, which essentially informs liberalism and secular fundamentalism, is that if we're animals, then just as no animal owns property, so it's inappropriate for humans to own property. And so there is a uniform hostility to property ownership and property rights on the left. And indeed, this has been a struggle that reaches all the way to the Supreme Court, and right now we're awaiting a ruling from the Supreme Court on the Kelso taking clause, which is exactly at the heart of this, which is that the anti-biblical element in society believes that human beings have limited need for property and limited rights to property, whereas the government retains it. Basically, the government should own everything, and the biblical side says no. God wants us to own property. Very much that is part of the divine plan, and so I gave as an example the idea that a cow might say to the farmer, we've all had a little meeting, us cows here. We've sort of decided that you're taking a bit too much of our milk. We'd like to work out a cap, that you won't exceed in terms of taking the milk. The farmer bursts out laughing and says, you poor dumb animal, I don't think you realize I'm here to provide you with security from the cradle to the grave. And in exchange for that, I take all your milk. That's the deal. And if you think about that for half a moment, you realize that's exactly the deal of socialism, essentially to enslave the population with the promise, the unfulfilled promise of eternal security. We'll feed you, we'll educate your children, we'll give you medicine when you're sick, we'll give you money when you're too old to work, and in exchange for that, we essentially tax you at the maximum possible rate we can get away with. That's the deal. And it's not a deal that anybody with any biblical loyalty should ever accept.
Amen, Rabbi. So I just actually have a couple of questions. I strongly recommend any of our listeners to go to your website, because one of the things I think is brilliant is you have a section called Ask a Rabbi, and this is where people submit questions to you. And I just had two quick questions for you on them. One, I got a lot of thought from this, and it made me, again, change my thinking, which I thank you so much for, was the question from a girl called Leah about reading your emails or your letter. And your answer was about the German Rabbi Gershom, who decreed reading other people's mail was illegal, and you speak about how was it before that. How can we get to a point where it's not just laws, that we bring morals back, that we don't need a government legislating what's right and wrong, that we understand ourselves?
Well, right now, the truth is we have to recognize there's a civil war. God willing, it's going to be one fought with ballots, not bullets. But the fact remains that we're no longer one nation under God, indivisible, not at all. We right now are two separate nations, and in exactly the same way. In the middle of the 19th century, we didn't say, well, you know what, everybody should do whatever they want. It was understood that on such a fundamental question, we had to be one nation going one way or the other. And exactly the same is true now on the integrity of biblical marriage, on the integrity of economic freedom. all of these issues are going to have to be decided. And I think that's what makes this period we're living in so very critical, at the same time very exciting, an opportunity for each and every one of us to play a crucial role like you are doing with your program. The people, the inspiration and the guidance and the encouragement that you provide to your listeners is one that I'm very proud to participate in and help with. But that's the challenge that lies ahead. Essentially, what sort of country are we going to be? Are we going to become on those fundamental issues?
And last question, again, this is from your site. The story of the lady who wrote into you said, my 10-year-old son lost a friend because he told her he was Jewish. And I think the one part that really struck me in your answer to was that, sometimes the cult of victimhood is destroying so many people that, sometimes we have roadblocks and we need to overcome them. How can we encourage people and empower people to see things as roadblocks and not as, not as something to stop us, but for something for us to overcome?
Well, personally, I think that the survival of the country depends upon a revival of fervent, deeply committed Christianity. Judaism is already experiencing a resurgence of commitment and faith, but the numbers are too small. So when it comes right down to it, the country will be able to be turned back onto its correct trajectory only by a large-scale revival of Christian commitment. And that's what I pray for. Even as an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, I pray for that, because I think that without that, we're doomed.
Awesome, Rabbi. Thank you for spending some time with us and coming on our show. Again, your website was youneedarabbi.com, correct?
youneedarabbi.com is correct, yes.
Awesome. For more about...
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for listening. For more shows just like this, visit us on SoundCloud by searching Truth and Liberty Radio.